growing up, I was not allowed to have a video game system. And it was I speaking of public speaking, I would spend time crafting persuasive arguments. I would make basically like sales pitches to them about like why I should get it. I've done the yard work. I've been doing really well in school, stuff, the usual stuff you'd expect from a kid. And they cracked up. They loved it. And they would just be like, no, because then we would lose out on these great sales pitches. So living under that tyranny, I was allowed to play computer games, and it was mostly strategy and kind of like historical games. I read a lot of like history and historical fiction as a kid, um, so those were the games that I was kind of gravitated to. I remember the first game I really played was a remake of a board game. It was made on the Commodore 64, and it was called Wooden Ships and Iron Men, and it was sort of like a tile-based movement, like ship. Like you got the Pirates of the Caribbean ships, and you try to like draw a broadside, um, and hope that like you just blast the other guy better than he blasts you. It was I loved playing that. Pretty limited as you might imagine for a Commodore 64, but from there it kind of like progressed what you would expect. I did like Age of Empires. I even convinced my third grade teacher to let me install it on the school computer, and I would play that during like winter recess instead of like just chilling in the gym with the kids. And then Total War is really what I got into a lot. I started with Rome, played Shogun. I kind of skipped medieval. I came to that later. But yeah, mostly like strategy games growing up, anything kind of historical based. I played Halo with friends, like Mario Kart, the Zelda, the classics. But a lot of that, was like in a group. So even when I did play Zelda, it would usually be just like part of a game, right? I rarely like was able to sit down and just play like a whole long game through. Like we'd like take turns with like Banjo and Kazooie or Crash Bandicoot levels. But it was always like gaming for me growing up was usually if it wasn't me in front of the computer, it was me playing with friends, very communal, right? Pass the controller around, playing Halo, split screen, no screen cheating. So yeah, that was definitely how I did it. So the result means I don't play many shooters. I've done my time. I played PlanetSide 2 for more hours than I care to admit, but for the most part these days I still play strategy. Colony Managers is what I'm into now these days, but growing up it was often like turn-based games and anything historical.
Do you ever take that strategy into the competitive, or you are more like you versus the computer?
So it was usually me versus computer. I don't think I really played many of those games online. I played StarCraft, so that was probably like the earliest I played online multiplayer games. I was never like any kind of competitive. I didn't really play ladder. I played a few times, got smashed. I was like, okay, I'm gonna go back to like people I can like maybe compete against. But recently I've been playing Total War Warhammer multiplayer. And it's been really cool to see because I do love kind of watching these small competitive scenes build up. Growing up, I was like really involved in fencing, and fencing's like small enough that you can like kind of go far on even a national level and like see a lot of tournaments. And because it's small enough, you have to like volunteer for a lot of these. So I do
Mm-hmm.
love there's like a communal aspect. Like the Total War Warhammer scene is small enough that like competitors are also involved with like planning the tournaments and setting it up. And I really like do kind of miss that from growing up from fencing. So it's cool to see that in a community going on.
Nice. Brought up fencing. I just see this one of the reasons why I'm so
Mhm.
excited that we have you, because even though we have like not unlike wooden ships and Iron Men, we have passed by each other
Mhm.
multiple times, but I've never actually got the chance to speak with you. So this
Yeah.
is actually enlightening. You brought up RTSs and fencing. I fenced for a very short period of time. I think it was one season. It was
Nice.
very fun.
Yeah.
I was disappointed because I wanted to get the Sabers,
Yeah.
and because I wanted to be like Sinbad,
No, nice.
not the stand up comic, but the old school,
Hmm.
like adventurer.
Hmm.
And our coach was like, "That's nah, you can't just jump to Saber." And I was like,
Nope.
"Oh,
You got to put in
okay,
the
well,
grind.
I guess we'll stick with these flails." And so,
Yep.
and then I was like, "I'm going back to like track."
Yep.
Like I
Yeah.
quickly left that, but I've never even dipped my toe into RTSs.
Mm.
Um, like last week we had Fada on, um, And we talked about fighting games. Fighting games I'm not good at all, but it's something that I have at least tried.
Yeah.
I've never even come close to an RTS. Like I'm trying to think. Like I've done strategy,
Yeah.
but normally it's turn based. Like you're like an XCOM.
Hmm.
But I know nothing of real time strategies. They've always been there. They've always been
Hmm.
there, but I've never even. I don't even know.
Yeah, I've loved them for a while. There's several that I dipped my toe in. I remember before you could really do online gaming, we had a LAN center that me and my friends would like, you could stay the night in it basically. Um, and we would play a lot of Battle for Middle Earth, which is like a real-time strategy. Like it's kind of StarCrafty meets Lord of the Rings. Um, but the way it was balanced, you could have massive swings back and forth, and we would play 3v3. And a single match would take us like 3 hours to play because, of course, we're like all in the same room, like screaming at each other, talking a lot of trash. But it could be like, "Oh wait, come help me!" And like it could be like on the brink of a loss, and all of a sudden, like it swings the other way around. So I do always love that in the strategy games where um, you can usually play your way out of a lot of situations.
Yeah. Well, I will say, like, of course, as always, we discuss, your background, and
Mhm.
it's always nice to hear a background, but then it's always a lot more interesting, not more interesting, but just as interesting to hear, like, what brought you to DCGG? Like, how I know you're like one of the founders.
Mhm.
So like, what led you from, like real time strategy, and like casual gaming with your friends? What brought that into like running, DCGG?
Yeah. So Creston and I actually met professionally through something called Tag Labs, where we would be teaching kids how to code by making little games. And so, gosh, we did that for 5 years or more.
Ah, yeah, it was a slog.
Yeah, we did it for a while. But we like appear and we met like a lot of folks in the area through cons and just volunteering and contracts and stuff. So it was cool to see that community in DC. When you hear about DC, that's not what people mostly picture. Even people from around the area, I don't think would kind of picture DC as like a tech spot or particularly like gaming heavy. But there's definitely a strong community out there. And so Chris, hit me up. It's like, hey, we know this community's out there. Let's try to bring it together. Let's give it a space. Um, and so yeah, it's been a pleasure getting to work with it and see it grow, see familiar faces and new. Um, and like I said, like growing up, to time to sound like an old man, but like gaming was very communal. Like it was just very like even if it was like Legend of Zelda, I can go watch a YouTube video of somebody playing it. So even if I'm just watching my friend play it, like sure, I'm gonna show up and get experience it that way. Um, so I know we kind of got struck by 2020, but I'm very much looking forward to when we can have people back together in a room, just kind of meeting and talking and sharing in the fun of play.
Yeah, so speaking of, because we were hit by 2020 and a lot of stuff has been virtual, um, I don't think a lot of people might know your screen name and
Mhm.
like know you through like I don't know if I can say your wit. You're pretty funny.
I try to
That's one of
troll
the reasons
around a
why I
little
enjoy
bit.
you because you're very funny. Like pretty much every comment you have is like real quick and like the perfect timing
Mhm.
for which is hard to do through Discord. So even though people might not necessarily know your face, because I haven't don't know how many like events you actually host yourself, but like what are you working
Mhm.
on DCGG that people might not actually know because they don't like see you on the front like that.
Yeah, so I've been working kind of behind the scenes on a lot of like our posts and social media, trying to organize things. I was streaming on Sundays, growing our stream. I would like to. I've been in the game club, which I think will be, is going to be talked about a little later. But um, there's I could see myself doing events of kind of odd games. I think the games that I play outside of the strategy, a lot of the colony managers I like because of they can be repeated and it's not necessarily different gameplay, but they create different tales. So one game is called RimWorld, and it's basically a storytelling game that a guy coded, where he wanted. If you've heard of Dwarf Fortress, it was kind of based off this idea of you could have these different like colonists you manage, and you don't have full control over them. Like you can give them jobs to do, but like if they like have been cold for like a whole year and you haven't dealt with that, they're gonna break and they're gonna like start setting things on fire, or they're gonna like dig up corpses and stuff. And so a lot of the game is just sort of like gentle chaos that you can control, and then it can escalate into vicious chaos. Um, and
Like
so the
emergent storytelling? Is that like
yeah,
how?
basically, yeah. And
Ooh,
there's like a storyteller behind the scenes where like as your colony grows, it'll like send different challenges at you. Um, and it really just makes for different like kind of crazy again internal stories. So that's something where like it's not great for game club because there's not like a defined game to play through.
yeah.
But each time you play, you're creating a new story, right? Like the whole premise of this is like you crash landed people, you're trying to survive. Can you make it? And these storytellers are going to throw a challenge at you. And you might have somebody that's like a tortured artist with a great memory, and he's a pyromaniac. And then somebody else is going to have like all these like other traits. And so making like trying to like keep them all from basically getting themselves killed um, is endless fun. I've yet to succeed. Colonies always fail at some point. So
This sounds like fun. This sounds like something I could like
mhm.
live in.
And so outside of like RimWorld, which is a very deep experience, I think there's a lot of like small indie games that would be really cool to also explore that do interesting things with storytelling. Um, and so I'm trying to like look on itch and stuff and like find games that might be even something that like I kind of want to stream. Is like look for like little web games or stuff like that. Stuff that may not see the light of day, but could also become like I think what Celeste started as like a Pico 8 game, right?
Yeah.
Um, so like there could be these really cool and unique games, like kind of marker games of a genre that people are, you know, just working on, chugging away on their own. I will say the problem though with some of these games that are outside of itch that aren't just web based is they tend to be deep systems. Another game that got updated recently is called Star Sector, where it's a universe you can kind of colonize a planet, or you can like be a pirate fleet, or you could like work for the Imperium, and like stuff like that. You could become like this religious fanatic in it. But a system like that is like super deep and takes like dozens of hours just to be able to like, okay, here's the kernel of like game I want to try to play. Like, okay,
Yeah.
this time I'm gonna be a mercenary captain or whatever.
So
But I mean,
Cole,
those sound like I don't like. So I often I'm a big board game person. If I
Yeah.
haven't said that enough on this podcast yet, I'm probably more of a board game person than I am a video game person. And one of the things that I realized, like the more and more different kind of board games I've played over the years, is that they're basically all just toys.
Yeah.
They're toys that come in a box, and like there's a piece of paper in there that says these are the rules of how to play with this toy, and
Mm.
then you play with the toy, and it's just basically like systems. You would just enjoy the system that is there. And maybe that system is to get a bunch of points at the end. Maybe that
Mm.
system is, maybe you want to become the best religious fanatic. So like I kind of I understand that joy of just messing with systems and seeing
Yeah.
what pops out, or losing. You'd be like, oh, I died.
Mhm.
I
Yeah.
didn't know that was possible. But I pushed, I messed around with the systems long enough, and I don't know, you found the right series of cards, and you put them all down in the row, and no one can ever beat that, beat that system.
Yeah.
Things like that. So I kind of get where you're coming from.
So that, funnily enough, the seeds of that were planted in my liberal arts education. So I got a bachelor's in political science. I had taken some computer science courses, and when I was a freshman, I was like, maybe I want to do computer science. I took some courses, realized I'm a big dumb when it comes to programming, and noped out. Um, but funnily enough, for my political science senior thesis, I was looking at a constitutional case being brought before the Supreme Court of the United States, and I'm forgetting the name now, but it was a senator from California. It was basically against I think Activision, no ESA, the Entertainment Society.
Software Association or something.
Yes, yeah, I think that's it. They're basically the lobbying branch of the video game industry. And it was the typical violent video games, government ban. And so I wrote my thesis on basically the online organization to oppose this and how digital protest will be shaping the future of political movements. I could have possibly been on something really like smart and like kind of foretelling of our weird online dystopia we're living in now. Um, but I didn't necessarily hit on that. So I was looking at that Supreme Court case and looked at video games as storytelling because a central tenet to the ESA winning that case was video games can be defined as art. Art is broadly defined in the basically like in jurisprudence and how we interpret it through the law, and video games count as art. Um, and so looking at how that argument was made is like, oh yeah, like there is more. Like I'd played video games, don't get me wrong. Like I loved Mass Effect, thought its storytelling was great, um, but I hadn't like ever really like dove into that kind of idea. I think a lot of game designers and people who do writing about like video games are very tired of the video games are art argument. People saying yes, people saying no, yada yada. It seems like it's not even a really productive conversation to have. So I kind of came at it from this like social side, and then I had an opportunity through my employment at AU to go through their master's program, and that was pretty interesting because it's not fully technical focused. It also looks at the social side. And like you can do writings, and they've encouraged, I think they maybe even have students published in like human computer interactions, HCI. And so our professor kind of came at it, or some of our professors came at it from that angle of like, yes, there's a way to create games. Let's make some money. Let's make Valheim. But also like, okay, like how can we explore how we interact with our technology? Games are one way we do that. In many ways, games are shaping how we're going to be using our phones and any other digital technology moving forward. So that was like a lot of like how I looked at games and sort of is what I'm doing work wise. I do some contract work making little educational games. Um, we're in early stages still, but think of it like doing a diorama, right? So like they have to replace the elements of a game. It might just be a basic like brick breaker or like a little platformer game, but you can be Shakespeare collecting scrolls that have a line from a sonnet. And so the student has to put in the art stuff that might be in the background during Shakespeare's time and put in the lines of the sonnet, but that's about it. Maybe like 3 pictures and some text. So that's I can't say I'm like working for like a big AAA developer. I'm not like deep in the game development, but I've been doing small projects for about 4 years now.
So,
Awesome.
yeah, what would you, I guess, for somebody that also doesn't have, a typical tech background,
Mhm.
meaning you know programming, you know art, X, Y, and Z, but somebody that's interested in just making games, like, what would you, what advice would you have, and then also like where would you point them to
Mhm.
get started?
I mean, I think, funnily enough, talking about the systems of board games is a good way to think about it. Like, you can make board games. That was actually one of our courses. Was like we had to make board games, and that's actually kind of nicer because you don't got to fight technology, especially if you don't really already know how to code. Um, but like you just grab some like sheets of paper, rip it into little cards. Okay, let me figure this out. You can have a 6-sided die, or you could buy like some D&D die if you really want to like try to math it out. Um, so I think just think about interesting interactions. Like that's ultimately what any game comes down to is just an interesting set of interactions. Um, and so from that, then I think you eventually rubber's got to meet road, right? So I can say like go on YouTube, which truly there is like every tutorial you need out there. But my God, start simple.
Yeah,
Like keep it
absolutely.
ugly, keep it hideous at the start, um, and just try to get those interactions working because it is easy to fall into like massive time sinks. Like I've spent like 2 weeks working on something, taking a step back and be like, oh God, this is useless. So,
You know,
well, and a good way to sort of temper that, or at least expose yourself to different things, is game jams.
yeah,
Especially with 2020, there's a lot more virtual game jams, and I suspect more will continue. And I guess like a game jam by nature is like virtual since we're always uploading it to whatever website. But itch.io, like this is probably gonna be my little soapbox for this talk. Is like if you're interested in playing new, interesting games, or if you're planning on getting involved in making new and interesting games, um, I'd recommend go to itch.io. They have a huge list of like game jams happening every week, every day. And that's where you can find a lot of like new and upcoming games. There's a lot of like the visual novels are there. Um, so if you got like a story you want to tell, honestly, that's probably a good way to get in. Honestly, use something like Twine. There's a lot of like tools to make basic visual novels, and you don't need any coding for that. It's if you can use an Excel spreadsheet, you can make a visual novel game in a lot of these tools.
So you mentioned game jam. What specifically is a game jam?
Okay, yeah. So a game jam is basically where um, people will, for a set amount of time, agree to a topic usually and make a game. Sometimes there's constraints like only use this engine or it has to be like only this many lines of code or whatever. Usually not though. So like just join. There people will form teams as well, and that's a great way to meet new people if you are somebody trying to break into indie space and find team members. But if you're new, like they're welcoming of newcomers, and it's just a great way to get, um, I don't know, in over your head in a responsible way, because it can be hard to like actually see a complex project if you're at the beginner stage. I feel like for a lot of people learning coding, you can like, okay, Code Academy, let me like do this beginner stuff, and like it is like a entry point, but then moving beyond like making your first like hello world is I feel like there's just it's hard to bridge that gap.
Yeah.
And game jams help you do it because somebody's already there to help pull you across.
So
And like we saw this with tag too, where like
yeah.
we could get the kids at least like a lot of them to start, but of course it requires some kids just have to be dedicated and want to like do some of the projects. But you really kind of need somebody to help you get across, like because it's easy to hit a wall, and getting over that's so difficult. I think with coding because frankly, a lot of the community isn't amenable to helping pull you across or pull you up
Yeah.
that gap. But um, game jams are mostly specifically designed for that. They're not really competitive. There are some, um, but yeah, and it's a great way to network. That's also forgotten. Games are so complex and hard. Having any even just one other person to help is massive. So
Absolutely.
you can't sleep on networking.
And then the last thing that you mentioned, itch.io. What specifically is that?
So that is a place for, and it's uh, a game platform, kind of like Steam or Epic Games, but it takes. I don't even think it takes a cut. It takes a very tiny cut, if any, of games being hosted there. You can host mini web games for free. That's how game jams often do it, and it's a place where you can play, buy, and sell your game, and assets too. I've bought, especially music and sound effects. I can at least draw stick figures and basic pixel art and stuff, but I don't. I don't know the first thing about making sound effects, so I use it a lot for that.
So it's kind of like SoundCloud for video game development.
Yeah, and all the pieces associated with it. You can buy sprite asset packs. You can play the games themselves, and like you can host your own stuff. And again, it's got a tool to find game jams and to run game jams. Yeah, I mean, I think we got some strategy players out there. I've seen people talk about Civ and stuff. So I think being able to host and like accommodate people playing, because like a board game, it can be difficult or take some coordination, right, to get all the people around the table, so to speak. Um, Whoever can figure out how to make a good asymmetric strategy game is going to make a lot of money. Put it that way. Um, so I would like to do that, but I'd also like to the game jam, like you mentioned. I'd like to do that at some point. I think we have a couple people doing or interested in development. Um, and even if it's just like everybody working on one game, right? Like we're not doing our own game jam, but we're entering as a team essentially into another game jam. Um, because I know some people might be interested, and again, that first step, it's like, oh, I don't even know where to begin. Don't worry, we'll take your hand and bring you across.
Yeah, no, it was the biggest game club yet. Uh, we was able to get everybody in there. I learned that it was it was hard to get like little fun facts and extra like all like extra uh, what's the word I'm looking for? All like just extra information about the game, like outside of the game itself, um, compared to like the month before that being Obsidian and the Outer Worlds. Yeah, the Outer Worlds. Like that was just chock full of information. This one, on the other hand, not so much. But that game is deep, and there's a lot of interesting, like because the game's unfinished, and because like there's a lot, it's not very straightforward. There were a lot of conspiracy theories, just fan theories. Um, there was a whole section after the game that there was unlockable swords, and people were learning about that for the first time. It was fun just to introduce like new concepts of a game that you have beaten. To be like, oh yeah, this is that. There's a Silent Hill reference that some people didn't catch. There's a robot that gains sentience and then kills itself, and you get an achievement for it.
It's a
Like
dark
it's
game.
like yeah, exactly. So like, there was just like little things that were fun. It was a very fun game club. It was a very fun game club. Um, and then for April, we have decided that our game will be Control, Remedy's Control, and I don't know. I'm looking forward to it because, like I said, I picked up the game for like 20 minutes. Was like, this is great. Put it back down. Haven't really returned. Uh, but like the more I look into it, people are like, oh, it's a pretty hard game. I don't know if I'm looking for a hard game right now. That's Game Club for April, and we'll as always on DCGG Direct. We'll talk about it a little bit here and there, not giving too much away for the Game Club itself, and if you're hearing this and you're part of DCGG or you're not part of DCGG and you're hearing this, consider coming in the game club. There's literally nothing to lose there. You don't want to commit to anything else at DCGG. Just come to game club. It's one meeting a month. That's all we're asking you. One meeting. Get deep into the game as you want to. You don't have to beat it. You will get spoiled if you don't. Just putting that out there. But just one meeting a month. Come, have fun, learn to love us.
Absolutely.
A bunch of points at the end. Maybe that
Mm.
system is, maybe you want to become the best religious fanatic. So like I kind of I understand that joy of just messing with systems and seeing
Yep.
what pops out, or losing. You'd be like, oh, I died.
Mhm.
I
Yeah.
didn't know that was possible. But I pushed, I messed around with the systems long enough, and I don't know, you found the right series of cards, and you put them all down in the row, and no one can ever beat that, beat that system.
Yeah.
Things like that. So I kind of get where you're coming from.